The cowboy and the Apache girl who returned after 10 years. The desert had a way of making a man feel small. It stretched across the Arizona plains like an ocean made of dust and stone, endless and silent beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow every thought that dared rise beneath it. The wind drifted low across the sand that morning, whispering through brittle sagebrush and rattling dry grass like bones. Far in the distance, dark mountains stood like watchful giants, their jagged peaks softened by the pale light of dawn. Storm clouds had only just begun to break apart after a violent night of thunder and rain. The desert still carried the smell of wet earth and lightning. Puddles shimmered in shallow depressions, reflecting streaks of pink and gold from the rising sun. It was the kind of morning that felt both peaceful and lonely. Daniel Hart rode slowly across the plains, his horse stepping carefully along a narrow stretch of dry riverbed. The cowboy sat straight in the saddle, broad-shouldered and quiet, the brim of his weathered hat casting a shadow over calm, thoughtful eyes. He had lived most of his life out here. His ranch lay miles behind him, little more than a modest wooden house, a barn, and a stretch of fencing that tried its best to tame the wildland surrounding it. Daniel wasn't the sort of man who cared much for towns or crowded saloons. The desert suited him better. Out here, a man could hear his own thoughts, and Daniel Hart didn't speak many of them. Most mornings were the same, checking fences, looking after the cattle, riding long distances under the unforgiving sun. The work was slow and steady, and it kept a man honest. There was comfort in that rhythm. But that morning, something unusual waited for him in the silence. The horse shifted beneath him as they approached a bend in the riverbed. Daniel's eyes drifted across the sand, scanning the ground out of habit. Then he saw it at first. He thought it was just debris left behind by the storm, Small shape curled against the earth. He slowed his horse. The wind moved gently across the riverbed, pushing strands of dark hair across a pale face. It wasn't debris, it was a child. Daniel slid down from the saddle, boots crunching softly against damp sand. The closer he stepped, the clearer the sight became. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her clothing was torn and covered with dirt, and faint bruises colored her arms. One of her ankles looked swollen. She lay on her side, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of shallow breaths. Daniel knelt slowly. The girl's skin carried the bronze tone of desert tribes, and a thin leather cord hung loosely around her neck. Tiny woven patterns decorated the edges of her clothing. Apache. That single realization settled heavily in the quiet morning air. The relationship between settlers and the Apache people was complicated. Suspicion ran deep on both sides. Many townsmen would have turned away, pretending they never saw her. Helping her could bring trouble. The tribe might believe he had taken her. The town might believe he had invited danger. Daniel studied the girl for a long moment. Her face was smudged with dirt, but even through the dust he could see the fear frozen in her expression, as if she had been running long before the storm ever arrived. The wind shifted again. Daniel exhaled quietly. Then he removed his coat and gently draped it over her small body. He didn't say a word. Instead, he lifted the girl carefully into his arms and carried her toward the horse. Sometimes compassion was not a decision spoken aloud. Sometimes it was simply the thing a man did when no one was watching. Daniel's ranch sat beneath a wide stretch of sky, surrounded by open land that rolled endlessly toward the horizon. The house itself was simple weathered wood, a slanted roof, and a porch that had seen years of wind and dust. Inside, the warmth of a small fire pushed away the morning chill. Daniel laid the girl carefully on his bed. Her ankle was badly sprained, but not broken. A shallow cut along her arm needed cleaning, and she carried the kind of exhaustion that only came from fear and hunger. He worked quietly, cleaning wounds, wrapping cloth around her ankle, placing water beside the bed. Hours passed before the girl finally stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, dark and alert. For a brief moment she looked confused. Then she saw Daniel standing across the room. Fear flashed instantly across her face. She tried to sit up too quickly and winced in pain. Daniel raised his hand slightly. Stepping back. Easy, he said softly. His voice carried none of the roughness often heard in frontier towns. It was calm, patient. The girl watched him carefully. She didn't understand all his words, but she understood his tone. He placed a small bowl of broth beside her. Then he stepped outside, giving her space. Trust, Danielle knew, was not something You demanded that it was something that arrived. Slowly, like sunrise, days turned into weeks. The girl remained at the ranch, while her ankle healed at first. She spoke very little. She watched Daniel from a careful distance, studying every movement he made. When he worked outside, she sat quietly on the porch, her sharp eyes following the rhythm of ranch life. Daniel never pushed conversation. He simply shared small kindnesses. Food left beside her chair, blanket when the desert nights turned cold. One evening he noticed her staring at the stars above the open sky. "They're brighter out here," he said quietly. She didn't answer, but she stayed beside him a little longer than usual. Little by little, silence turned into understanding. She told him her name, Aiyana. It meant eternal blossom in her people's language. Daniel repeated it carefully. The girl smiled faintly. It was the first time he had seen her smile one afternoon. As the desert wind drifted lazily through the yard, Aiyana approached him while he repaired a broken fence. In her hands she held a small woven bracelet. It was made from thin threads of colored fibers twisted carefully together, forming patterns that reflected Apache craftsmanship. She hesitated for a moment, then she held it out to him. "For you," she said softly. Daniel looked at the bracelet. She shrugged gently. "So, you remember." He took it carefully. The threads were simple, but the meaning behind them felt far heavier than their weight. Daniel tied the bracelet around his wrist. "I'll remember," he said. But the desert had its own plans. One morning, riders appeared on the horizon. Apache warriors, their horses moved swiftly across the plains, kicking dust high into the air. Daniel stepped outside as they approached. The leader dismounted slowly. His gaze moved immediately to Aiyana. Relief softened his hardened expression. She ran toward them. The reunion was emotional, filled with words, spoken quickly in a language Daniel couldn't understand. Before leaving, Aiyana turned back toward him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she touched the bracelet on his wrist. "I remember you," she said quietly, and then she rode away with her people. The desert swallowed the riders until they became nothing more than shadows on the horizon. Daniel stood alone in the quiet wind. The bracelet remained on his wrist. 10 years passed. The desert changed little, but people did. Daniel's hair had begun to show faint strands of gray near his temples. His ranch had grown larger, his cattle herd stronger, yet the quiet loneliness of the plains remained unchanged. That the bracelet never left his wrist. Most days he barely noticed it anymore, but sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the desert turned gold with evening light, he would remember the small girl who once sat on his porch watching the stars. Then one afternoon, a rider appeared. She came across the plains with confident grace, her horse moving as if it understood every thought she carried. The wind caught the edges of her dark hair, and the sunlight reflected off subtle beads woven into her clothing. Daniel watched from the ranch fence. Something about the rider felt familiar. When she dismounted, the truth became clear. He said quietly, she was no longer a frightened child. She stood tall and strong, her presence carrying both the quiet wisdom of her tribe and the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. "You kept it," she said, glancing at the bracelet. Daniel nodded. Double quotes. "Always." She stepped closer. "I came back," she said. "Why?" Aiyana smiled softly. "Because 10 years ago, a cowboy saved my life." She paused, her voice steady. "And because I chose you." Not everyone welcomed that choice. When word spread through the frontier town, tension rose quickly. Some townsmen feared the union between a cowboy and an Apache woman. Some members of her tribe worried she was abandoning tradition. One evening, a group of men rode out to Daniel's ranch. Their voices carried suspicion. "Daniel," one of them said, "this could bring trouble." Before Daniel could answer, Aiyana stepped forward. Her eyes burned with calm strength. "No," she said firmly, "this is not trouble." The wind moved softly across the plains. "I was a lost child in the desert," she continued. "He helped me when no one else would." Her voice carried across the open land. "Kindness has no tribe." Silence followed. The men looked at one another uncertainly. Slowly, the tension faded. The wedding took place weeks later in the open desert. It was held at sunrise, where the land stretched wide and free beneath the endless sky. Members of the Apache tribe stood on one side, townspeople gathered on the other, and in the center stood Daniel and Aiyana. The wind moved gently across the sand as the sun rose above the horizon. Daniel held her hands, The woven bracelet still rested on his wrist. Two worlds that had once stood apart now shared the same quiet moment beneath. The same sky dot, and as the first golden light of morning touched the desert plains, it felt as though the land itself had chosen peace.